At exactly 3:17 a.m. Washington time this morning, a classified intelligence leak triggered what may become the most explosive political rupture North America has faced in modern history. Within minutes of the document surfacing, officials in Washington and Ottawa were forced into a 36-hour emergency confrontation involving Arctic surveillance systems, strategic energy corridors, and nearly $912 billion in cross-border trade exposure. Behind closed doors, diplomats are scrambling to contain the fallout, while financial analysts warn that a fracture between the United States and Canada could send shockwaves through global markets before the day even ends. Yet most mainstream outlets are still cautiously framing this as a routine dispute. It isn't. Subscribe now, because the timeline you're about to hear explains why this crisis could escalate far beyond what anyone is publicly admitting. To understand why this fictional crisis escalated so quickly, we need to examine the sequence of events piece by piece. Because what appears on the surface as a sudden diplomatic dispute is, according to analysts in this alternate scenario, actually the result of 4 separate pressures colliding at the same time. Each one on its own would be manageable. Together, they create a geopolitical pressure point that could destabilize the entire North American alliance. Let's begin with the first layer. Evidence 1, the intelligence leak. The entire chain reaction started with a classified intelligence document circulating inside several government agencies shortly after 3:17 a.m. Washington time. According to fictional analysts examining the leak, the document outlined the existence of an advanced surveillance system monitoring shipping lanes across the Arctic corridor. This region has become increasingly important because melting ice has opened new commercial routes connecting Asia, Europe, and North America. In this fictional scenario, those routes carry an estimated $912 billion in annual trade flows, including energy shipments, rare minerals, and critical manufacturing components. The controversial detail wasn't the surveillance itself. Intelligence monitoring is common among allies. The shock came from how extensive the monitoring allegedly was. The leaked report suggested that surveillance coverage extended deep into infrastructure networks tied to Canadian energy transport and northern logistics systems. That discovery immediately triggered alarms in Ottawa. Within hours, senior officials demanded explanations through emergency diplomatic channels. What was supposed to be a routine intelligence clarification suddenly became something much larger. A 36-hour negotiation window designed to prevent the situation from spiraling further. And that leads us to the second layer of the crisis. Evidence 2, the Arctic Energy Corridor. The Arctic is no longer just a remote region covered in ice. In recent years, economists have begun referring to it as the next strategic energy frontier. Under this fictional scenario, the Arctic Corridor now controls transport routes tied to roughly 18% of the world's untapped energy reserves, including natural gas, rare earth minerals, and offshore oil deposits. Several multinational energy projects worth $73 billion in combined infrastructure investment depend on stable cooperation between northern governments. That means any disruption in the region doesn't just affect diplomacy. It affects energy prices, global supply chains, and financial markets. In this fictional timeline, once the surveillance leak surfaced, investors began calculating the worst-case outcomes. Would cross-border energy pipelines be delayed? Would Arctic infrastructure projects be frozen? Would shipping routes suddenly face regulatory barriers? Within a few hours, analysts projected that even a temporary diplomatic freeze could threaten $214 billion in manufacturing supply chains tied to cross-border industrial cooperation. If you're starting to see why financial markets would panic, press the like button right now. Because the third layer of this crisis is where the pressure really starts to build. Evidence 3. The economic domino effect. In normal circumstances, economic integration between the United States and Canada acts as a stabilizing force. The two economies exchange more than $2.6 billion in goods and services every single day. That level of integration means supply chains are deeply intertwined. Automobile manufacturing, aerospace components, energy distribution, agricultural exports, all of it depends on uninterrupted cooperation. In this fictional scenario, once the intelligence dispute escalated, economists began warning about a domino effect. If diplomatic trust breaks down, regulatory barriers could appear overnight. Factories on both sides of the border could suddenly face delays in parts deliveries. Energy exports could slow. Transportation corridors could tighten. One fictional economic strategist described it this way: when two economies this integrated experience political friction, the consequences spread faster than policymakers expect. Supply chains don't collapse instantly. They fracture gradually, then suddenly. That's exactly what markets began pricing in. Currency traders started hedging against volatility. Energy analysts began predicting supply uncertainty. Investment funds quietly shifted billions of dollars into defensive positions. And while none of this meant immediate economic collapse, it created something almost as dangerous: systemic uncertainty. But even that doesn't fully explain the tension building behind the scenes. For that, we need to look at the fourth and most sensitive layer. Evidence 4. Strategic signaling. When diplomatic crises emerge between major partners, governments rarely escalate publicly at first. Instead, they send subtle signals. In this fictional scenario, analysts noticed several unusual signals appearing almost simultaneously. Military logistics flights increased along northern routes. Several joint planning meetings between defense officials were quietly postponed. And strategic policy advisors began discussing contingency planning if diplomatic talks failed. None of these moves indicated an imminent military confrontation, but they did signal something equally important. Both sides were preparing for prolonged uncertainty. And once governments begin preparing for long-term instability, negotiations become significantly more complicated. Because neither side wants to appear weak. Neither side wants to concede leverage. And neither side wants to be blamed for triggering a larger geopolitical fracture. In fact, several fictional geopolitical analysts studying this scenario have suggested that the real danger here isn't a sudden confrontation. The real danger is miscalculation. If diplomatic signals are misinterpreted, if economic pressure intensifies faster than expected, if public narratives begin hardening political positions, then a manageable dispute could slowly evolve into a structural rift between two long-standing partners. Which brings us back to the central question hanging over this entire crisis: the clock. Because in this fictional scenario, diplomats are working against a 36-hour deadline to stabilize the situation before economic and political pressure makes compromise far more difficult. And when deadlines like that approach, leaders often face choices that will shape the geopolitical landscape for years. As the diplomatic clock in this fictional scenario continues counting down toward the end of the 36-hour emergency window, policymakers are facing a set of choices that could reshape the future of North American cooperation. Analysts studying this crisis outline 3 possible paths forward, each carrying dramatically different consequences. Scenario 1. Full de-escalation. The first possibility is the fastest path to stability: a comprehensive diplomatic compromise. In this outcome, both sides agree to transparency measures surrounding the surveillance dispute. Independent oversight mechanisms are established to review Arctic monitoring activities, and a new bilateral security framework is introduced to restore trust. Energy cooperation resumes almost immediately. Arctic infrastructure projects continue. Markets stabilize. Financial institutions estimate that under this scenario, global trade disruption would remain minimal, with cross-border supply chains returning to normal operations within 2 to 3 weeks. Politically, both governments would likely frame the resolution as a demonstration of alliance strength. The narrative would shift from confrontation to cooperation. But this outcome requires something that becomes increasingly rare during fast-moving crises: mutual political restraint. Scenario 2. Partial compliance. The second possibility is more complicated. Instead of a full settlement, negotiations produce only limited concessions. Certain surveillance programs are scaled back, but not fully dismantled. Diplomatic statements emphasize cooperation, yet the underlying mistrust remains unresolved. This scenario creates what analysts often call a cold partnership. Trade continues, energy flows remain stable, but strategic coordination begins to weaken. Over time, policymakers on both sides quietly begin reducing reliance on cross-border systems. Supply chains diversify. Infrastructure planning shifts toward domestic alternatives. In economic terms, this slow decoupling could redirect tens of billions of dollars in investment away from joint projects. Markets would not collapse, but they would adapt. And once that adaptation begins, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Scenario 3. Structural breakdown. The final scenario is the one economists and security experts fear most. If negotiations collapse entirely, the diplomatic dispute could evolve into a prolonged strategic rupture. Under this outcome, Arctic cooperation freezes. Joint infrastructure projects are suspended. Regulatory barriers begin appearing across sectors previously defined by seamless integration. Supply chains tighten. Energy prices fluctuate. Financial markets react to rising geopolitical risk. Within months, analysts estimate that cross-border trade friction could place pressure on hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity. More importantly, the political consequences would extend far beyond economics. For decades, North America has been viewed as one of the most stable strategic regions in the world. A visible fracture between its two largest partners would force policymakers globally to reconsider long-standing assumptions about alliance durability, which is why the next several hours in this fictional scenario matter so much. Because once diplomatic deadlines pass, the choices available to leaders often narrow dramatically. And history has shown that when pressure builds this quickly, the outcome is rarely predictable. Right now, in this fictional scenario, the clock is still ticking. What began as a single intelligence leak at 3:17 a.m. Washington time has rapidly evolved into a geopolitical pressure test for one of the world's most stable alliances. The economic exposure is massive. The diplomatic stakes are rising. And every passing hour inside that 36-hour negotiation window increases the risk that a manageable dispute could harden into something far more permanent. History shows that alliances rarely collapse in a single moment. They fracture through a series of escalating decisions. So here's the question: has this crisis already crossed the line where trust can no longer be fully restored? Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next analysis as this fictional scenario unfolds.